Good morning and welcome to the European Parliament broadcasting from Strasbourg today. A few days ago, Donald Trump, US President, finally formalized his previously announced tariffs on steel and aluminium, respectively, of 25% and 10%, an announcement that shocked the world of global trade. Now, the damages onto the European industry of steel and aluminium are estimated to be over 6 billion euro. Here in Strasbourg, there's a lot of talk about a trade war or the potential consequences that this will have on the European market. To discuss the issue today, I'm accompanied by Maricia Schaake, who is a member of the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament and our spokesperson on trade. Maricia, thank you for being with us. Maricia, let's start with a bit of a background. What does this announcement mean for America, for Europe, and for global trade?
Well, I think we've seen actually the quite shocking response to the tweets that the president sent. I mean, the stock markets in the US went down, one of his most important economic advisors resigned, Speaker Ryan in the House of Representatives finally came out and actually protested this position taken by the administration. So some checks and balances are kicking in at long last. But to be honest, we still have a lot of questions unanswered about what it really means, because it looks like the angry tweets that the president sent were not coordinated across American government, and they are still working out some of the details and the questions themselves. So it's actually very shocking to see that such an important announcement has been made with such little preparation and heads up to us in Europe. I mean, it came as a total surprise for everybody.
And then what has been Europe's response to this announcement?
So I think it's really important, amidst all the strong words used in the United States and also speculations in the media, that we keep our heads cool. We live at a moment where we have challenges from China, for example, when it comes to dumping of steel and other products onto our markets, when it comes to state aid and subsidies that are not transparent and not in line with what we expect to be fair trade. So we have work to do, but it makes no sense as liberal democracies to be pitted against each other. Instead, we should work together. And so what it means is that Europe should keep its head cool and stay focused on WTO compliant measures, but be ready, absolutely ready, and we are, to apply countermeasures should it be necessary and when the US follows through with its announcements.
You talk about fair trade and countermeasures. These are very measured words. But the two words that are trending now on social media related to this topic is actually trade war. What would a trade war mean for Europe and the world? And who would be the winners and losers of a war, of a trade war? Who would they be?
So, if it's trending on Twitter, that's actually quite dangerous, because trade wars are nothing to take lightly. If you look at what the President Trump was tweeting, saying, oh, you know, trade wars are easy, we can win them, it's a misreading. If you look at history in terms of what trade wars have actually meant, they have often been the start of a very dark page in our history. So I fully reject those who are thinking about it too lightly and or throwing this term around as if it's nothing. An actual trade war would mean that there are measures on one side, countermeasures on the other, countermeasures again, and sort of a tick-tock downward spiral in terms of measures to protect the market or to respond to unjust protections of one market. So basically a back and forth, a downward spiral of a tit for tat that keeps on going, and that really will have a strong impact on our global economy, which is not zero-sum, as President Trump seems to suggest, but rather we are mutually dependent. So this notion of, you know, having countermeasures towards each other would be a downward spiral, and that is what we could consider a trade war.
What I can see from this is that these measures are hardly just about trade. They will have consequences also on the relations between America and the world, and especially America and Europe. How will this affect our transatlantic relation?
You know, trade is always also about geopolitics. It is never only about economic relations. It is very much about cooperation, a rules-based system, you know, fairness, a multilateral system that creates a level playing field ideally. So we should never only think about trade in economic terms. But what we've seen from the US now, which is actually very concerning, is that they have invoked a national security argument. They have said that it is justified to impose tariffs on steel from a national security point of view. And that is in direct conflict with the notion of an alliance that we have through NATO and through our long-standing, very solid cooperation since World War II, for example, in together building a multilateral system, a rules-based system. So the question of invoking other arguments like national security adds a dimension to this already very, very tense situation that I think is unjustified and misguided.
And the arguments you just presented pretty much fit into Mr. Trump's electoral motto, so America first, and now keep America great. So his rhetoric has changed, has evolved once more from the campaigning time after these pretty exceptional measures. Now, how does this affect also the sustainability of the American economy, the fact that they're closing in while Europe is trying to promote cooperation and collaboration with the different partners? We see our biggest ally to close in and put in place more protectionist policies. How will this affect America's sustainability?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting to hear promises of America first and make America great again, because the expectation is that these measures will hurt American jobs, the prices for American consumers. It is an illusion to think that by closing your market, you can help your own industry. We are already so mutually dependent. So let's take a concrete example. Budweiser beer.
Yes.
It's a beer that Americans like. I'm not a beer drinker, so I'm not going to do a quality assessment of beer, but it comes in cans oftentimes.
Right.
And also for the military, there's not even enough aluminum on the American market itself to meet the production needs. So what is it going to mean for those who want to produce products made with aluminum in the United States? Is going to be a challenge when there's tariffs. And it is likely that there will be not so much a higher price paid for the raw materials, but it could also be that the production of cans, of half products, of full products will actually turn out to be cheaper imports. So basically the production could ebb away from the United States as a result of higher raw material prices. It's one example. Another example is, of course, countermeasures that might come, not only from Europe, because we are really looking at proportionate measures not to escalate this tension, because we do not want a trade war at all, and we want to be very, very balanced and proportionate in the measures we might have to take as a last resort. But it's not necessarily the same everywhere in the world. We've heard threats expressed from the Chinese side that they will impose countermeasures, and so the backlash into the American economy may well lead to job losses precisely in those areas that have a lot of Trump voters. And that's probably why you see a lot of criticism from people in the Republican Party who also represent some of these districts. It is very important to think about the future of work, to think about what people need in areas that used to flourish with industrialization and with production. But it doesn't mean that every measure is the solution. So I think we have to be smarter than that and look for sustainable solutions. And part of that solution is, together with the US, tackling unfair trade practices from China.
Another trending word has been exemptions. So there has been some speculation about some countries that might be exempted. And Donald Trump mentioned exactly this, and I'm going to quote, that Canada and Mexico will be exempted because of the ongoing negotiations on the NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. Now, we have heard, there are rumors that there might still be a chance that the European Union will get an exemption on that. What is the current status of this, and what would be the next step in case there was to be an exemption for the European Union?
It's actually not a rumor. It's a very targeted effort by the EU to make the clear case, which I think is clear and should be clear on the American side anyway, but we are allies. We should not be caught in this national security labeled round of tariffs. So I think that that is the very, very strong and sound argument that we hear from the European Commission. I hope it will convince the Americans, but frankly, and this is actually perhaps another reason why all of this is so disturbing, we used to know quite well where the United States stood, what their policies were, that we are roughly, as liberal democracies, aligned on a number of issues, especially compared to, top-down, mercantilist, closed, repressive societies that are growing in this world. And now we don't really even know how to read our friends in America anymore. We don't know what might happen tomorrow. Very important advisors are fired or resign. We see a new morning, a new tweet. We have no idea what the next day might bring. And this unpredictable nature of this American administration, I think, undermines its credibility and makes it harder for us to work with them, because predictability in an alliance is very, very important. And so I'm worried about this, to be honest. I mean, I have a big transatlantic heart. I studied in the United States. I studied American studies in Europe. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I'm vice president of the US delegation. I fundamentally believe that we must work as closely together as possible. And I've actually invested in that with my work, and I believe in it. But right now, I really wonder what is happening. And I think it is essential that we look beyond only the administration, beyond only the White House in our relations with the US. So we, as members of European Parliament, are engaging with members of Congress. We particularly look to the Republican members of Congress to provide those checks and balances that are the promise of American democracy. And we also look to the private sector to speak out. We look to civil society, people-to-people contacts, because I still believe the transatlantic relation is the best alliance that we have, and it would be very, very dramatic if it would be eroded so easily and would take such a dramatic turn from the past. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of Americans that are very worried about this as well.
You talked a lot about transatlantic relationships, and Guy Verhofstadt in his plenary speech yesterday mentioned that we must not look for a trade war, we must find a new deal. And talking about deals that have been negotiated for a long time, a few months ago it seemed that TTIP, the Transatlantic Investment Partnership, was dead. Now, in light of this sudden change by the US administration, is it possible to consider that a free trade agreement between America and Europe, with even the goal of lowering or even scrap tariffs, would be beneficial at this stage?
So I think you're asking the wrong person. I mean, we had been negotiating for years between the EU and the US about a comprehensive trade and investment partnership. It was not easy. Let's not underestimate how complicated these negotiations are. But we were dedicated to making sure that with high standards and strong rules, we could indeed lower tariffs or scrap them in many cases, create more market access in the United States, and provide for smoother trade that's already there, but really add to our intense cooperation and make it easier for SMEs and others to do business in the United States. I think that goal is very worthy. I mean, I worked on it for years. Despite a lot of political heat, I recall plenty of panels and emails and discussions and tough questions from journalists. It was really a very tough debate already. But the fact that it is now in the deep freezer is not Europe's choice. It is already the product of Trump policies that has made, like I said, a very dramatic change from the past in terms of its commitment to rules-based trade. And the fact that there is no longer a negotiation on a transatlantic trade and investment partnership is because of what is happening in Washington. And I think because there have been so many unpredictable, angry tweets, accusations towards the EU, unjust and misguided labels of, national security tariffs and this, that, and the other, it will make it much harder to reignite any such negotiations now. Because, for negotiations, there has to be a basic trust. There has to be a basic understanding of what the stakes are on the other side, and how serious we are to working out differences, how committed we are to our relationship. And I frankly think that the lack of clear direction in the US now makes it very hard to even start a discussion like this. So I don't foresee a scenario in which TTIP would be invigorated soon.
At the beginning of this interview, you mentioned China as a major player in global trade. What will be China's reaction to the US administration's formalization of these tariffs?
So I think it's twofold. On the one hand, I think any country that is not liberal democratic, that doesn't believe in open economies, open societies, and sadly there are many, I think those countries benefit from a weaker transatlantic relation. You know, look at how much Russia is trying to do to tear the EU apart, to tear the transatlantic partners apart. I'm sure that they are looking at this, you know, with a smile. Similarly, in China, I think they have no problem seeing a weakening of the alliance between liberal democracies, and they are sort of indirectly strengthening their position through this, even though the tariffs would hit them as well. But they've already announced countermeasures, and I think they will be much less proportionate. There might be a mix of trade measures and more political measures. Who knows what we'll see? Who knows what we'll see? I mean, I think our priority should be to keep a focus on a rules-based system, preferably work with the United States to ensure that China adheres to global trade rules, that together we strengthen the WTO, precisely because we need to address unfair trade practices. But of course, a more credible starting point to try to convince others to adhere to rules is to lead by example. That is what we hope from the United States.
I'm going to take a couple of questions and comments from Facebook. I see that a number of users are actually pointing at the fact that both Europe and America are taking care of their own businesses. And I see this comment in different languages. What do you respond to that? Basically, our social media audience is saying that they're just taking care of their electorate, whether it is in Europe or whether it is in America. What do you respond to that? Do you think we are going towards more protectionism? Do you think this is just the way it's going to be in the future? And governments will try to focus especially on their electorate instead of moving towards more open economies?
So this is the political battle of our time. I think that that's clear. In Europe too, we see nationalism, protectionism rising. But I believe that the negative consequences for the voters that we should all care about most, the people who have the least certainty in their jobs, people who have seen industries that they worked in, you know, that they cared about, disappear because of globalization, because of servicification of the economy, so from industry towards more services. These are very, very serious concerns, and I understand that it is upsetting people. But to put a ring around the United States will probably not solve the problems of these people. And so I worry also about false promises to people who are already in an economically vulnerable position and who may be easily persuaded by pointing fingers elsewhere, you know, whether it's to immigrants or to other countries. And instead, I think we should not underestimate that this is not only a matter of reorganizing a national economy, it is also about shaping globalization and being realistic that reindustrialization in some sectors in the United States is unlikely. It is probably a better idea to re-educate people and to look at what sort of social provisions are necessary to provide a safety net for people in the most vulnerable circumstances. Of course, we think fundamentally different about this in Europe, where we have a much stronger social safety net, where we have re-educating programs, and still we have challenges of our own. But I think that false promises are also something that we need to challenge, and that actually will only erode the trust in politics and will only make it worse for people who may hope that President Trump will offer a solution, but who may soon see even more jobs leaving the areas that are already under pressure.
One last question is about Brexit. Is there a danger that the UK government might try to seek a backdoor deal outside of the European Union and make their own agreement with the US administration?
As soon as they're no longer members of the EU, they are free to do that. And I think they will find soon enough how difficult it is to negotiate with such a large country, and that there will also be consequences for the UK in relation to the EU, that they would presumably also want to have a good and solid trade agreement with. At least that's what I hope. So the choices that the UK has are not endless, and they can only decide to have any trade agreement with a third country when they actually leave the European Union. But I do think that speculating about it now, we heard some sound bites over the weekend from people like Liam Fox that maybe they would seek a separate exemption from the EU. I mean, first of all, it's not allowed. We are still all 28 members of the European Union, and I think that's with good reason. But we know that unfortunately the UK will be leaving the EU. It's a big loss for us. It's a big loss for the UK, I believe, but it's their choice. But I do hope, and that's what we debated yesterday here in European Parliament too, I do hope that we can have as good, as frictionless, and as mature a relationship with the UK going forward. And to do a sort of backdoor deal with the US right now would probably not inspire a good negotiating climate between the UK and the EU. And if that's what the UK chooses, it is up to them after they leave the EU, but I would hope that they will see the full picture of their interests and the importance of a good relationship with the EU going forward.
Marietje, you will allow me one more question because our audience is quite savvy on the topic.
Yes.
And we even have fans from South America. Some have expressed the worry that these new measures might then delay or disrupt Europe's relations, trade relations with other parts of the world. Do you think there's a danger that now Europe is going to focus too much on fixing this transatlantic partnership and forget about the rest of the world?
Well, it's not Europe forgetting about the rest of the world. And actually, you can also see the opposite happening, really. I mean, firstly, let me say that indirect consequences of these tariffs could well be felt anywhere in the world. So I do think that it's a legitimate concern from people in Latin America to look at what is happening. The US is a major economy and their policies have ripple effects all over the world. So we have to be realistic about that. But the EU, after Trump was elected, after the US made such a dramatic change in its trade policy, has actually stepped up to the plate. And I'm fully supportive of that leadership by Commissioner Malmström and also in this parliament to say we still stand for a rules-based trade system. We want to strengthen the WTO and the multilateral system, and we are going ahead to engage in bilateral agreements where there's no other option. So we've seen the conclusion of a deal with Canada, of a deal with Japan, and we are very committed to seeing progress in negotiations with Mexico, Mercosur, the Latin American countries, and others. So I would not be too worried about the US being the EU being too distracted. Instead, I think we have a renewed sense of urgency and a deeper commitment to strengthening the rules-based system. We're happy to work with partners all over the world, including in Latin America. So I hope that this sense of urgency is also felt over there.
Marietje Schaake, thank you very much for this extensive interview. You will be able to replay this video on our Facebook page, and you will find the links to Marietje Schaake's social media in the description of this post. You can keep following the ALDE group on all social media, and you can keep up to date with all the activities of the European Parliament in Strasbourg under #ePlenary. Thank you very much for being with us today.